Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories, and this is Heebie-Jeebies TV. Now we're back with another top 5 video, but before we get into that, of course, just sending you guys a quick friendly reminder to comment, like, subscribe if you guys really enjoy my content. I really enjoy seeing a lot of you guys come over from TikTok and vice versa as well. I am extremely thankful for all of the support and encouraging comments you guys are leaving. It really does help me push forward. So if you guys wouldn't mind, just comment, like, subscribe, or even just share this video. It would really help me grow here and I would be extremely thankful for it. I also just want to send a quick shout out to Steve from Missing Persons Mysteries. He actually shared one of my videos a couple weeks back, and coincidentally, it happened to be on my birthday. He did not know that and he didn't have to do this. So I am extremely thankful towards him. It really did help me get an extra push in subscribers. So Steve, if you're watching this, thank you so much for doing that. It was really, really nice of you. And if you guys are interested in his YouTube channel, it's really good. It's mostly about missing people, missing persons cases in national forests. I am obsessed with his channel. I watch it all the time. So if you guys are interested, I will link it in the description box below. All right, so let's get into today's video. Now, today we're going to talk about 5 reincarnation stories that I find to be extremely interesting and quite convincing. Now, this is a topic that has fascinated me for a very long time. I don't know about you guys, but if you guys are into the occult, spiritual stuff, or even true crime stuff, most of us in this realm tend to believe in an endless amount of possibilities, and I find that reincarnation is definitely a topic of interest here. I consider myself to be somewhat of a spiritual person, so I definitely believe that reincarnation is possible. Even though we don't have hardcore evidence to prove it, there are just so many stories out there that are way too convincing to just be a coincidence. There's a lot of evidence that supports the possibility of this being a real life phenomenon. And actually, one of the stories that truly made me a believer in this was the story of Dorothy Eady. She was a British woman that fell and actually went through a near-death experience. And when she came to, she started acting like a completely different person from a very young age. And throughout the rest of her life, she was convinced that she was actually a reincarnated ancient Egyptian priestess. And she seemed to know quite a lot of information that she just possibly could not have known. And she even ended up helping Egyptian archaeologists and historians decode some hieroglyphics and answer questions that they could not figure out. And I actually did a video on her a while back. So if you guys are interested, I will link it up here and I will link it in the description box below. So definitely take a look. All right, so let's get into story number 5, and that's going to be James Linenger. So James was just 2 years old and he was living in Louisiana when he first started exhibiting very strange behavior. And the first thing his parents noticed was that he was oddly obsessed with playing with little toys that were planes. He did show interest in a few other things, but his interest and his attention was really just on these little toy planes. As he got a little bit older, his strange behavior escalated and turned into nightmares. He would quite literally wake up in the middle of the night. He would run screaming into his parents' bedroom while he was saying, airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." His parents had no idea what to make of this phrase. They just kind of basically thought that he must have been having a nightmare, and a very vivid one at that. This went on, and his parents just kept chalking it up to a wild imagination or even possibly things that he had seen on TV. However, that changed when James started verbalizing facts about World War II that there's just absolutely no way he could have known. He would tell his parents that he was a soldier during the Second World War who coincidentally also had the name James. He was able to recall more details of who he was, including that he had flown off of a ship called the Natoma, and that he had also had a friend and a colleague that was named Jack Larson. So, of course, his parents were getting curious at this point and they started doing some digging. And to their surprise, there indeed was a aircraft carrier during the Second World War that was called the USS Natoma Bay. And even more surprising, there was a pilot on there that was called James Huston. And tragically, he had passed away during war over the Pacific Ocean. As for Jack Larson, he was also a very real person. And at the time that this was all happening, he was still alive and he was living in Arkansas. So back to James, whenever he would play with toy planes, he would look at a specific part of the plane and his mother would call it something else, but then he would quickly correct her and tell her that it was a drop tank, which he actually ended up being correct about. But this again puzzled his mother and his parents. How could he have possibly known the correct term for a part of an army plane? Another instance was when he was watching the History Channel with his parents. The narrator of the show referred to a Japanese plane as a zero, but James quickly corrected the narrator and said that he had made a mistake and that the correct term for that plane was a Tony, and he ended up being right about this. Then things took a somewhat of a dark turn when James began recalling details of the day he passed away. He said that his plane had been hit by the Japanese head on and then crashed into the ocean. Of course, his father wanted to do some digging about this. He wanted to see what the real story about this alleged James Huston was. He was able to confirm this with another pilot who knew James Huston during the Second World War, and this guy's name was Ralph Clabor, and he was able to get details about what happened. He said that he had been flying right next to James on March 3rd, 1945, when suddenly James's plane was hit head on right in the engine by anti-aircraft fire. This then caused James's plane to pretty much explode mid-air and then crash. As James got older, his memories eventually began to fade, which is what happens with most people as they start to get older. They start to forget a lot of what happened in their past life. So even though his memories did fade, everything that happened was more than enough to convince his parents that James had indeed been a soldier in the Second World War. Story number 4 is about a man named Sonny Ray. Now, this next story comes from a couple that wanted to remain anonymous, and it said that the wife was a scientist and an author, while her husband was also a scientist who had several patents under his name, who we will call Michael. And science started almost immediately. So when Michael was just an infant, whenever his father would be holding him, Michael was fascinated with his father's watch that happened to be a Rolex. Anytime his father was holding him and he was wearing this watch, little Michael would grab at it, he would play with it, he would point at it. And eventually, when he got a little bit older and was able to form words, he would point at the watch and say, "Mine." As he began speaking more and more, he would start to refer to himself as Sonny and actually became very insistent that this was his name and this is what he wanted his parents to call him. Eventually, his mother kind of caved in and came up with a sort of nickname for him with this name, and she ended up calling him My Little Sunray. When he got a little bit older, he told his mother that in his previous life, he had been married to a woman named Dawn and that they both had lived in Texas. Considering the family lived in California at the time, this was a very odd thing for him to say because he had never ever been to Texas before. And the strange behavior really just continued from there. He would prefer to listen to country music, whereas his parents would constantly listen to more classical music. And he knew the words to these country songs so flawlessly that it shocked his parents. One day, his mother was reading him a story about dogs, and when Michael saw a photo of a white Cocker Spaniel, almost immediately he yelled out in excitement, "Hey, that's my dog Willie." When Michael was about 7 years old, his parents had flown down to Texas for a seminar they were hosting, and they had actually scheduled a woman that was supposed to speak at this conference, and coincidentally, her name was Dawn Ray. Of course, the name rang a bell for Michael's father, so he approaches the woman, they engage in some small talk, but then he asks her if she happened to be married. She then replies to him that no, that she was actually a widow and that her husband had passed away several years prior. He then asks her what her husband's name was, and to his surprise, she says Sonny. At this point, Michael's father is completely shocked, so he asks Dawn if she wouldn't mind coming over to their hotel so they could talk in a little bit more detail with a little bit more privacy. Of course, he tells her that his wife would also be there, so Dawn agrees. When she arrives to the hotel, they tell her that they have a son, Michael, and that he had been spewing this very odd information that he was adamant that he was a man called Sonny that lived in Texas and that he was also married to a woman called Dawn. He then asks the woman if they happen to have a dog, and she replies that yes, they did have a dog, and his name, of course, was Willie. At this point, things were just too strange to be just a coincidence for Michael's parents, so right away they coordinate for Michael to get on a flight to meet Dawn. So Michael arrives at the Texas airport and his parents pick him up without telling him where they were going. So they arrive at Dawn's house, and the moment Michael sees Dawn, he yells out her name and literally ran towards her with open arms. She was absolutely stunned, but of course she was extremely curious and wanted to know more. So they all go into her home, they sit down in her living room, and Dawn asks Michael her first question. She says, "Do you recognize this house?" Michael immediately tells her no, that he does not recognize it. And this was a big test for Dawn because she had only moved into that house years after Sonny had passed away, so there wouldn't have been any way for Sonny, if this was him, to recognize this house. Surprisingly, Michael then asks Dawn if she kept his guitar and his watch, both of which she did. And of course, the watch, you guessed it, was the exact same one that Michael's father wore all the time, which is why he was so obsessed with this particular Rolex. And they continued to talk for hours and hours, and Michael just kept knowing things he shouldn't have known, which basically left everyone completely stunned, but it also made them all believers. After meeting the family, Dawn was so captivated about what had just happened that she actually ended up selling her home in Texas and moved to California to live with the family as kind of like a nanny so she could be closer to Michael. She would then spend the next several years looking after him while Michael's parents would travel for work. Finally, though, Dawn ended up moving to New York City when Michael was about 14 years old. He didn't really need a nanny anymore, but when she said that she was going to move, Michael was said to have been so distraught that he basically begged his parents to allow him to move to New York City with her. And surprisingly, his parents did allow him to move to New York with Dawn. She was totally fine with it, and it's said that ever since then, they had been living together. This next story takes us to 9/11. Now, there's this woman named Molly, and she had a son called Cade. And again, like all reincarnation stories, well, at least most of them, Cade began talking about his past life from a very young age, specifically at the age of 3. His mother said that from a very young age, he just seemed to be more grown up than the rest of the kids his age. He just seemed to know bigger words that she didn't really use very often, or that she was surprised he just happened to know. Like the previous story, he would also wake up in the middle of the night and would stumble into his parents' room screaming and crying quite hysterically. At first, it was quite hard for his parents to understand what he was saying, but once he was able to put a few words together, they were able to piece a sentence that said that he was basically working at a very tall building, and then out of nowhere it fell, and that's where he passed away. Curious about what was going on, like any parent, Molly ended up questioning her son a little bit more to see if she can get any more detail from him. All he really said was that he was working in the building, and he would remember being able to see the Statue of Liberty from the windows. So right away, his mother knew that he must have been talking about somewhere in New York City. On a separate occasion, he then gave his mother more detail, and he told her that when he was in the building, something ended up hitting the building from the outside, and then the building started to shake a lot, and that's when the building ended up falling to the ground. But if that's not creepy enough, he also said that as he was passing away, or when this entire thing was happening, he said that he was able to see himself from above, watching his body fall from the building down to the ground. So his parents then asked him to draw a picture of his dream so that they could better interpret what he was saying. And of course, he drew a photo of two very tall towers with a plane flying towards it, along with the man falling from one of the buildings. At this point, his mother basically was convinced that he must have been talking about 9/11, but this was also very odd to her. Cade was born after 9/11, and nor she or her husband had ever talked about this to him. Also, they hadn't shown him this on TV. He hadn't read about this in the newspapers, so they were very confused about how he knew details about what happened on that tragic day. If that wasn't weird enough, Cade also developed a fear of very tall buildings and airplanes, especially when he would see them in the air. And his grandmother also stated that it wasn't necessarily that he was afraid of the plane itself. She said that it was almost as if he was afraid of where the plane was going. And if you didn't know, phobias are a sign of reincarnation that usually have to do with some sort of past life trauma. So it's very common for people to have strange phobias that made absolutely no sense in their current life. But if you were to examine, or if they were to remember anything about their past life, especially when it comes to how they passed away, these phobias would probably make a lot more sense. By the time Cade was 7 years old, his phobia of tall buildings intensified, and it got so bad that he would have a really hard time being in the car whenever his parents would drive in the downtown area and there were tall buildings around. He had a hard time looking at them, and he would just verbalize that he did not want to go near them. But then things got worse. His nightmares kept increasing in intensity, and he kept claiming that Cade was not his name. And he actually ended up begging his parents to change it. However, his mother wanted to keep the actual name that Cade wanted to be called a secret because she wanted to respect the privacy of that man's family. So looking for answers, Cade's mother, Molly, started posting her story on multiple forums looking for any advice. And to her surprise, she received a response from another woman who said that Cade's story actually fit details of a man who actually did lose his life in 9/11, and he did work in the Twin Towers. And although, again, she chose not to share the details of this particular man or his family, she is convinced that her son was very likely this man in a past life. Our next story takes us to a small village near Agra, which is in India, and that's where we meet a little boy named Titu Singh. When he was just 4 years old, he started claiming that his real name was Suresh Verma, and that he had had a wife named Uma along with their 2 children that lived in Agra. And he also specified that they owned a little radio shop in town. He also started bothering his parents, begging them to take him to the city where his real family was. And on top of that, he also started insisting that his parents at the present day were not his real parents and that he wanted to see his real family. He then started talking about how he had passed away and claimed that it had actually been a murder. And he goes on to tell a very interesting story. He says that he had just come home one day and he was in his car. So he had pulled up to the front gate of the house, which was closed. So he honked his horn a few times, alerting his wife Uma, who was inside the home, that she needed to come open the gate. However, before this could happen, he said that 2 men approached the car from behind and ambushed him, and that's when he was shot in the head and the 2 men ran off. So we fast forward, and Titu's brother happened to be in Agra one day, and remembering all of these crazy stories that his little brother had told him over the years, he decided to see if he could potentially find this little radio shop that his brother had talked about so much. To his surprise, he found one with the name of the man his brother was claiming to be, and it was called Suresh Radio Shop. So of course, he goes into the store, he asks to speak with Suresh, and that's when he's told that Suresh had actually passed away several years prior. Wanting to know more, the salesperson at the store ended up telling him to go see Suresh's widow, Uma. So obviously, he goes to the address he was given, he talks to Uma and tells her that he has an unbelievable story that he wants to share with her. He goes on to say that his little brother is claiming to be her deceased husband, and that he seems to know quite a lot of detail that no one else would know, and that he had used that information to find the shop and again to find her. She was stunned and absolutely excited to hear about this, but she wanted to meet T2 for herself. She had also told her in-laws, so Suresh's family, about this entire situation. So her, Suresh's parents, and his 3 brothers joined Uma on her trip to the village to go visit T2. As soon as Uma and Suresh's parents saw little T2, he screamed and ran towards them with absolute excitement. He even started doing this little dance and hand movement that Suresh used to do, which almost basically solidified the entire thing to his family right then and there. Still though, the family and Uma wanted more confirmation, so they asked if they could bring T2 to Agra to confirm a few more details. So off T2 goes with his former family, and his first test was to lead the family to the radio shop. And his 3 brothers had actually tried to trick him by leading him in a different way than the taxi was going. But T2 caught on, and somehow he was able to successfully lead the entire family to the radio shop, which was more than enough to convince the entire family that Suresh must have been reincarnated as T2. And if you still don't believe that reincarnation is possible, listen to this. So a professor named Professor Chatta from the University of Delhi had heard about this story, and immediately it caught his attention. So he started doing some research and started interviewing Uma multiple times, asking her to confirm tiny details that T2 simply would not have known. Professor Chatta then tells a colleague of his named Professor Stevenson about this crazy story, which led both of them to doing more investigating. So before I explain this next part, one of the biggest signs of reincarnation that everyone seems to believe is a very obvious sign is a birthmark in the place that the person was hit or hurt that possibly led to them passing away. So since T2 had said that he had been shot in the head, both professors inspected his head for any signs, and of course they found something very interesting. To their surprise, they discovered a small indentation on one side of his head, and on the other side was a star-like birthmark that resembled a bullet exit wound. But there's still one more twist to the story. T2 said that he remembered the name of his attacker, and he gave the name of Sedik Johadian. And when the family reported this to the police, they tracked down this specific person, questioned him, and surprisingly, he ended up confessing to the crime. All right, our last story for today takes us to a place called Golan Heights, which is a region near Syria and the Israeli border. This story was published by a German therapist named Trutz Hardo, who had spent much of his professional career studying reincarnation. This story begins with a 3-year-old boy of an ethnic group called Druze, and to be transparent, this group of people 100% believe in reincarnation as a core belief. Once the boy was able to speak, he had told his family that he knew exactly what had happened to him in a previous life and that he had been murdered. The family started to connect the dots pretty quickly because since they knew about reincarnation, they automatically connected the boy's birthmark to something that had happened in a previous life. So this little boy was born with a fairly large red birthmark across his head. Although they still couldn't explain it, they knew that it was something of interest. So as the boy was getting a little bit older, the story grew with more detail, and he went on to tell a story that he had passed away due to an axe hitting him in the head by someone that he knew in a nearby village. His family wanted to help him figure this out, so they would take him on walks throughout local villages to see if he recognized anyone, and at first they didn't have very much luck. Then one day on one of these routine walks, they strolled through an area when the boy spotted a man and walked up to him and said, "Aren't you Eli?" The man was surprised. He had never seen this child before. And to be fair, Eli is quite a common name in this part of the world. However, the boy then tells him something extremely shocking. He says that they used to be neighbors and that one day they had gotten into a pretty bad argument that led to Eli grabbing an axe and then hitting him over the head with it. It was said that this man at this point went completely white as a ghost, but the little boy was not finished. He then tells him that he knew exactly where he had buried his body. following the conversation, the little boy then led his family to a pile of stones in an isolated area and said that this was where his body was hidden. So of course, the family starts digging, and you guessed it, to their surprise, there was a body in this grave. It was the body of a man who had a very clear and obvious wound to his skull. But the little boy was not done yet. He then led his family to another spot where he said that Eli had buried the axe. And of course, when they went there, they dug it up, they found the axe. So with all of this evidence, Eli was confronted with it. The police got involved, which basically forced Eli to confess. All right, so that does it for today's video. Let me know what you guys think of these stories. Which one do you guys think is the most believable? Do you guys believe in reincarnation? Are you more of a skeptic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, you guys, or check out my TikTok for more crime, creepy, and unbelievable content. The link is in the description box below. All right, thank you so much for joining me, guys, and I will see you in the next video.